The relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union in the late 1950s was one of contradictions. While both sides were trying to rapidly build stockpiles of nuclear weapons and were highly suspicious of each other, the period is also notable for the efforts made to de-escalate the possibility of armed conflict, led by Nikita Khrushchev's idea of peaceful coexistence. This included the resumption of the Four Powers summits, as well as Khrushchev's visit to the United States in 1959. An incident in May of 1960, however, derailed these attempts at bridge building between East and West. I'm your host David, and today we are going to be looking at the Soviet shootdown and capture of U-2 pilot Gary Powers and the impact it had on the Soviet-American relationship. This is the Cold War. So, in 1955, President Eisenhower had proposed that the United States and the Soviet Union agree to a plan for open skies. This plan would allow both powers to perform aerial reconnaissance over each other's territories and monitor their respective nuclear facilities in the process. Premier Khrushchev refused the proposal, which prompted Washington to authorize the development of a spy plane, which would be virtually impossible to detect. This was the U-2, developed by Lockheed and flown by CIA personnel. The U-2 was able to fly at an altitude of up to 70,000 feet and was equipped with advanced photographic technology. The first U-2 mission over Moscow and Leningrad took place on July 4th, 1956, with many more overflight missions being conducted. By the way, I strongly encourage you to watch our dedicated video on the U-2 spy plane to learn more about its design, development, and early missions. Now, with that in mind, let's focus on one specific flight, albeit one that failed, causing not only embarrassment for the United States, but also derailed discussions between the opposing blocs on the eve of a major summit. On the 1st of May 1960, leaders of both the armed forces and the Communist Party in Moscow were gearing up for the annual May Day celebrations, a parade intended to not only celebrate the glories of the working class, but also to showcase Soviet military prowess. But early that morning, Khrushchev himself was notified of an embarrassing piece of news. An unidentified foreign aircraft had violated Soviet airspace, and their much vaunted air defenses had been, yet again, unable to shoot it down. The premier himself phoned Marshal Biryuzov, commander-in-chief of the Air Defense Forces, angrily shouting, "Shame! The country was given air defense everything it needed, and still you cannot shoot down a subsonic aircraft." In response, the apologetic Biryuzov responded, "If I could become a missile, I myself would fly and down this damned intruder." If only, Marshal Biryuzov. If only. Now, the unidentified subsonic aircraft was, of course, a U-2 reconnaissance plane. It was flown by a CIA pilot, 30-year-old Francis Gary Powers. Earlier that day, at 6:26 a.m. local time, Powers had taken off from an airstrip in Pakistan, flying aircraft number 360. Article 360 had a reputation for being unreliable. In fact, after flying some 1,300 miles, or just shy of 2,100 kilometers, over Soviet territory, Article 360 malfunctioned when the autopilot stopped working. At this point, Powers considered aborting his mission, but he assumed manual control and continued on his flight plan, which would take him over Sverdlovsk, present-day Yekaterinburg, in the eastern Ural Mountains. From there, his flight plan would take him over Kirov, Arkhangelsk, Murmansk, and finally to Bodo in Norway. Unbeknownst to Powers, however, his difficult-to-detect aircraft had in fact been detected by Soviet radar as soon as he left Pakistan, while he was in flight over the Tajik SSR. According to Colonel Alexander Orlov of the Air Defense Forces, an alert was sounded immediately, which summoned all staff officers to their command posts. Word of the overflight spread from the armed forces to party cadres, and tensions began to mount. Khrushchev berated Marshal Biryuzov over the phone, who probably wished he could turn into that missile to get away from that phone call. As Orlov recalled, the aircraft thus was tracked from the ground in a tense atmosphere, nerves of military people at airfields, missile positions. The Air Force and the Air Defense Forces were badly frayed. Fighter aircraft were scrambled to chase the U-2, but they could not reach the correct altitude to get in position to shoot down the American plane. For reference, Powers was flying at 70,000 feet. Soviet Air Defense dispatched a Sukhoi Su-9 Fishpot, a high-altitude interceptor, with orders to ram the U-2 if necessary, but the pilot of the Su-9 could not locate the target, and Powers continued on his flight path, apparently oblivious to the commotion he was creating. The U-2 then approached an area covered by a battalion of S-75 Dvina SA-2 Guideline surface-to-air missile systems near Sverdlovsk. At 8:53 a.m. local time, a missile exploded behind the spy plane, peppering the tail and wings with its fragments. The U-2 jerked forward, and Powers was knocked back on his seat, shouting, "My God, I've had it now." Powers quickly realized that his craft was doomed and made his decision. He managed to free himself from the cockpit, not without difficulty we might add, and bailed out. Article 360 would be partially destroyed shortly thereafter by a direct missile hit. As revealed in April 1990 by a Red Army newspaper, the Sverdlovsk batteries had also shot down a MiG-19, which was in pursuit of the U-2, killing its pilot, Sergei Safronov. Powers' son, Francis Gehry Jr., would later visit Safronov's grave in December 2017 to pay his respects. But back in 1960, as recalled by Powers Sr., he landed near a collective farm and was quickly captured and handed over to the KGB. The Soviet security agency did not physically torture Powers, but they did interrogate him for 61 days, employing a variety of different psychological tortures, including sleep deprivation, psychological pressure, and bright spotlights. Throughout the ordeal, the captured American did not reveal the true operating altitude of the U-2s or the full range of missions taking place over Soviet territory. Powers withheld the name of his CIA superior and of his pilot colleagues, and did not mention the extent of British involvement in spy plane programs. In other words, he kept his mouth shut. But at this point, it's important to remember that Powers, who, although he had been in the US Air Force, was flying on behalf of the CIA and was therefore not a military prisoner. There was no denying that he was a spy, and as such, Powers was put on trial in Moscow from the 17th to the 19th of August, 1960. There was never any doubt of what the court would find, and Powers was issued a 10-year sentence for crimes of espionage to be served first at the Lubyanka prison in Moscow, and then at Vladimir prison, the infamous site that had been used to hold political opponents of the various regimes since the time of Catherine the Great. Luckily, Powers' sentence was cut short by a prisoner exchange. On the 10th of February 1962, Francis Gehry Powers crossed the Gleinicke Bridge in Berlin in exchange for Soviet spy Rudolf Abel. If that sounds familiar to you, it's either because you are familiar with Cold War history, or you've seen Steven Spielberg's 2015 film, Bridge of Spies. Maybe we'll tackle that movie and the story it tells at some point in the future. Now, when Powers returned home to the United States, he was actually attacked in the press, and public opinion of him was quite low. This may come as a surprise now, looking back, but at the time, he was being faulted for not having destroyed his plane or himself. Quoting from the New York Sunday Herald Tribune, quote, "Why, knowing that neither he nor the U-2 should fall into unfriendly hands, didn't he blow himself up and the plane? Why didn't Powers use the poison needle he had on hand, or the pistol he had with him?" End quote. Incidentally, that pistol that Powers carried on him was a high-standard HD-22 silenced pistol, which was on display at the KGB Museum at the Lubyanka in 1998 when I took a tour. Rather fascinating to see that little piece of history. But back to our story, Powers didn't only carry the standard issue pistol with him, he was also carrying a poison needle concealed in a fake coin. This, however, was not part of any standard procedure for CIA pilots to carry, let alone use. As for the aircraft, the U-2 was equipped with a self-destruct charge, but it was designed to damage only some of its more sensitive equipment. Eventually, despite being the guilty subject of a media tribunal, Powers was fully exonerated by both the CIA and the Senate Armed Services Committee. Powers went on to work for Lockheed as a test pilot until 1970, when his book, Operation Overflight, resulted in the CIA, who was paying his wages still at Lockheed, fired him. Francis Gehry Powers was killed in a helicopter crash in 1977 while working as a pilot for TV station KNBC in Los Angeles. Okay, so that's the course of events. But from a historical perspective, what did it all mean? What were the impacts and the results of this aircraft shootdown? Well, if we go back to the 1st of May 1960, Soviet air defense forces had scored a significant victory by shooting down an American spy plane. This meant that the May Day parades could now go on without embarrassment, at least without Soviet embarrassment. But what about Uncle Sam? At first, Moscow revealed that they had shot down a high-flying plane over their airspace, but made no mention of the pilot. CIA Director Allen Dulles had reassured Eisenhower that no pilot could survive a U-2 crash. This assumption led Washington to issue a statement on the 3rd of May claiming that the U-2 was part of NASA's fleet of aircraft conducting a routine weather flight. The statement went on to indicate that the pilot had blacked out due to a fault in the aircraft's oxygen delivery system and accidentally drifted over Soviet territory as a result. On the 5th of May, Khrushchev publicized some revealing details about the crash. The KGB had recovered equipment from the debris which hinted that the U-2 was actually on a spy mission and not just collecting meteorological data. 2 days after that, on the 7th of May, the Soviet leader unveiled his coup de théâtre, that the pilot of the spy plane was alive, and there were no doubts that the weather flight was a cover story for a mission of espionage. A livid Khrushchev denounced the United States for their treachery. He went on that the Soviet Union had been committed to a spirit of détente, but that this turn of events could jeopardize the upcoming Paris summit with the US, UK, and France, the first four-power summit since 1955. The Four-Power Conference, scheduled for May the 16th, would have been the occasion to address the issue of West Berlin. The exodus of workers from East Germany into West Berlin was a constant concern for the Soviet bloc, a concern which always ran the risk of quickly escalating into a confrontation with the Western powers. On May 11th, Khrushchev teased Washington at a press conference, warning against further intrusions of uninvited guests, as he called them. I consider myself to be an incorrigible optimist. I regard the provocative flight of the American intelligence plane over our country not as a preparation for war, but as a probing. They have not probed us, and we boxed the nose of the probers. On the same day, Eisenhower finally acknowledged his full awareness of Powers' mission. He defiantly defended the entire U-2 program, explaining that without the Open Skies Agreement he had earlier proposed, high-altitude flights were a key element of national defense, and that he had no intention of stopping them. In for a penny, in for a pound, I guess. In Ike's words, no one wants another Pearl Harbor. This means that we must have knowledge of military forces and preparations around the world, especially those capable of massive surprise attacks. Khrushchev now faced a dilemma. Not reacting to Eisenhower's defiant statement implied acknowledging America's right to spy on the Soviet Union. If he took a hostile stance, he risked compromising both the upcoming Paris summit and his overall plans for a Soviet-American détente. The day of the summit arrived, and both Eisenhower and Khrushchev had decided to attend. As the US president arrived in Paris on May the 15th, he learned that the premier had placed some conditions for the meeting to proceed. This included a requirement for Eisenhower to publicly apologize for the U-2 incident, to punish those in charge of the mission, and to make a promise not to fly over Soviet territory ever again. Eisenhower agreed to the last concession, but rejected the other two conditions. The following day, as French President Charles de Gaulle was about to inaugurate the summit, Khrushchev launched into a profanity-laden tirade condemning Eisenhower. The Soviet leader then stormed out of the summit, effectively sabotaging it. Adlai Stevenson, Eisenhower's Democratic presidential opponent, summarized the situation by stating that yes, Khrushchev had wrecked the summit, but, quote, "we handed him the crowbar and the sledgehammer." But the Paris summit was only the first domino to fall as a result of the U-2 incident. Next, the Soviet Union walked out of test ban talks scheduled to be held in Geneva on June the 27th. Then, an invitation for Eisenhower to visit the USSR was withdrawn. The president was also due to visit Japan, but following anti-American riots in Tokyo, Prime Minister Kishi canceled the invitation and later even resigned his post. The longer-term result then was that Khrushchev abandoned his plans to cooperate with Eisenhower, preferring to wait for the upcoming US election. As for Eisenhower, he refused to terminate the U-2 program. Advancements in opposing aerial defenses, but especially satellite imagery, although they didn't make the aircraft obsolete, had made the U-2 less critical for gathering information. So that's the conclusion. But now let's reassess the situation. Was the U-2 overflight and shootdown such a scandalous embarrassment, the reason that brought down all efforts to achieve détente? Well, not necessarily. In fact, members of Eisenhower's administration did not actually believe that the incident was the main reason for the cancellation of the summit. Diplomat and key advisor Charles E. Bolin, in particular, believed that the overflight was a lucky occurrence, a handy pretext on which Khrushchev pounced in order to sabotage the Paris summit, a conference in which he knew he would not obtain what he wanted. Historian N.C. Smith, writing for the Military History Journal, gives a similar interpretation, that the Soviets had known about U-2 overflights for years and had not protested earlier simply because they lacked the capabilities to intercept those flights. Publicly admitting that the U-2 missions were happening would equate to admitting the inferiority of Soviet air defense and its ability to defend the nation's borders. The shootdown of Powers' plane and his subsequent capture gave Khrushchev the opportunity to force concessions from the West regarding Berlin. As Eisenhower did not cave in to Soviet demands, Khrushchev decided to sabotage the Paris summit instead. The premier himself hinted at yet another way he had exploited the whole affair when meeting with JFK in Vienna in June 1961. After the meeting, Khrushchev reminisced, quote, "I joked with him," Kennedy, that we had cast the deciding ballot in his election to the presidency over that son of a bitch, Richard Nixon. By waiting to release the U-2 pilot Gary Powers until after the American election, we kept Nixon from being able to claim that he could deal with the Russians. Our play made a difference of at least 500,000 votes, which gave Kennedy the edge he needed. Regardless of the reasons which led Khrushchev to sink the Paris summit and his plans at détente, it was Dwight Eisenhower who more publicly felt the weight of responsibility for his handling of the U-2 incident. Shortly before his death in 1969, he reflected on the summit, stating, "I had longed to give the United States and the world a lasting peace. I was able only to contribute to a stalemate." We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss any of our future episodes, be sure to like and subscribe, and prepare to meet at the middle of the Gleinacher Bridge to swap your treasonous bell button for your opponent's equally treasonous bell button. A huge thank you to all of our Patreon patrons who help make this show possible, and if you aren't already, please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.